All right. Hey guys, welcome to our lecture today on the beginning and the fighting of the French and Indian War. A couple of things to introduce this topic to you guys. This is like the first really big international, like global war in human history. Now, there's been other big wars, of course, but this is the first time that you see fighting in a single conflict taking place in multiple theaters, like on different continents around the world. And this is pitting the great empires in Europe at the time, the British Empire primarily, against the French Empire. They have a long history of, going back and forth, the British and the French. In fact, the British take it as a point of pride when they can beat the French. But you'll also have other imperial rivalries joining in this as well, particularly the Spanish near the end of the war. Now, as far as the naming goes, this can bring a lot of students some confusion. So let's take just a moment to address this. When we talk about the French and Indian War, there you see the dates on the screen, 1754 to 1763. How many years is that? I know, do some math. I'll have to too. We'll use our fingers. That's 6 years, 7, 8, 9. So that's 9 years. But here's the thing, the French and Indian War is also sometimes called, especially like if you're not in the United States, you call this as part of the 7 Years' War. Say, what? It's 9 years. How are they not counting their fingers correctly or something? What's going on there? Oh, well, it's because actually the fighting in Europe doesn't begin until later. And then it doesn't end with the official Treaty of Paris until 1763. So if you do, I think 1757 or something to, or 1756, yeah, 1756 to 1763, that's actually 7 years. And that's where you get the name the 7 Years' War. But in the United States, this conflict begins a little earlier. In fact, it actually will begin with a very young 21-year-old George Washington, kind of right at the heart of beginning this conflict. And for our theater, our part, this North American chapter of the 7 Years' War, we call it the French and Indian War. Okay. Now, the last part of the naming convention, just so hopefully there's not as much confusion as there normally is the French and Indian part. Okay. Because it's actually the British and the British North American colonists and their Native American allies versus the French and their Native American allies. And so the ones that the British colonists are fighting are the French and the Indians. And that's where you get the name, the French and Indian War. Okay, now, all of that being said, let's begin talking about the geography, my favorite thing. I love geography. Take a look at this map here. This is showing who controlled what right in about 1754 when all of this was getting started. The blue is the French, the red is the British, the yellow down here with Florida is the Spanish. And you can see there's some striped areas. Those represent disputed lands that both empires are claiming. So this area right here, this disputed land, for the most part, we're going to refer to this, especially in this area of Western Pennsylvania. This is the state of Pennsylvania. We're going to call this the Ohio River Valley. And that is really where this conflict begins, kind of what it's mostly about, especially at the beginning. But there will be fighting not only in the Ohio River Valley, but in the Great Lakes and in Canada as well, especially like the famous battle that ends it here in North America, the Battle of Quebec, or the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Up here, that is between Maine and Nova Scotia. You can see Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, these Canadian provinces, they were actually part of the British Empire at this time. France geographically has a little bit of a dilemma when it comes to bringing supplies over, because keep in mind that Europe is, way across the Atlantic Ocean. Let me get my little pointer thing going. That might make it easier. So like Europe is way over here. Here's the Atlantic Ocean. Europe's way over here. And France and Britain, they need to send supplies over to their colonies, fresh recruits, troops, food, weapons, ammunition, all those things. Now, the British kind of have one serious advantage geographically in the sense that their colonies all border the Atlantic Ocean. Much easier for them to resupply. Now, look at the French. Up here, like for half the year, that's frozen. Okay, that's the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic Circle. That's not going to do you much good. The only real warm water port the British have access to is right here into the St. Lawrence Seaway. And through the St. Lawrence, see, that's the lifeblood of the French colony here, New France. That takes them into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, the Great Lakes region, and then into the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi, remember that had been claimed by the French like in the 1600s. Sieur de la Salle, the French explorer, had gone all the way down the Mississippi, claimed like Louisiana for the French. In fact, the state of Louisiana bears its name from the French king, King Louis, Louisiana. This region here between Maine and Nova Scotia that's disputed by the French actually had thousands of French colonists living there. That was called Acadia. More on that later. So this is what is going on. Another huge advantage that the British are going to have, besides, you know, easier access to resupplying, is their population. Of the 13 colonies here on the east coast of the United States, these had boomed. You had over 2 million British citizens, well, colonists, living in these colonies here, versus only a few thousand Frenchmen that were scattered throughout this vast region in blue. So even though it looks like France has a lot more land, actually it doesn't matter. They're all spread out. And remember, Native Americans actually control a lot more of this French land, which was why the French, remember we talked about this in Unit 1, this is why the French were much more reliant on their positive relationship with the Native Americans, because they needed the Native Americans because they were so outnumbered, versus the British that did tend to have a more antagonistic relationship. Now, one notable exception to that is in the New York kind of edge of the Ohio River Valley country here, Western Pennsylvania. In this area, the British do have a tentative alliance, a long-term relationship with the Iroquois Confederacy, which was one of the most powerful Native American groups in this region, which is so critical during this French and Indian War. That's like the Mohawk tribe and some of the others. So that's kind of what's going on. For the French, they will mainly have allies with the Algonquin people. That includes some of the Shawnee, like the Delaware people. We talked about who are also in this region, who maybe were not so friendly with the Iroquois, who were more sided with the British, or at least neutral, especially the first 2 years of the fighting. Let's see, the Spanish, we're not really going to talk about until the end. And that is the main stuff that is going on. Just keep in mind how tenuous this link is that France has to its colonies, that how easily that could be, you know, blockaded. And who has a really good navy that could, you know, cut off French resupply there? The British. They have the Royal Navy. And so having control of the seas will play a pivotal part. And when the British are able to successfully blockade right here and take, Fort Louisbourg, that's kind of when they are closing in on the French. And then they take Quebec, and you could see that's going to cut off all the supplies for this entire region. All right. So who controls more territory? More straight up territory. Who has, and by the way, the Spanish, we didn't talk about them. We talked about Spanish Florida. Spanish, keep in mind this time, they still control major islands in the Caribbean that they'd claimed like from the time of Columbus, like Cuba. You have the Dominican Republic, you have Jamaica. Actually, what is that? That's Jamaica. That's Puerto Rico there. You have the Bahamas and whatnot. The Spanish still controlled many of those Caribbean islands. And during the treaty negotiations, actually Caribbean islands were worth their weight in gold, or I should say sugar, right? Because that's what's being grown there. That is worth like everything for these empires, because sugar was so lucrative at this time. So actually in the negotiations, they're willing to trade like this little island right here, where the dot is, that's worth like all of Canada, basically, when this war is over and they're negotiating who gets to keep what. Please keep in mind how valuable those Caribbean islands were because of their sugar production. New Spain, we haven't talked about in a while. Keep in mind, it's huge. Just like the Louisiana territory, the French possessed New France, it's huge. but it's the same problem. It's largely unpopulated. So who has the larger population out of the Spanish, the French, and the British? It's the British, right? Here in the 13 colonies, 2 million colonists versus, you know, a few tens of thousands, and very sparse population in New Spain's North American colonies like New Mexico and Texas. I think they had less than 2,000 Spanish settlers in all of Texas at this time. There were less than 20,000 Spanish settlers in New Mexico, and I think half of that number were actually Pueblo Native Americans. So, and then California was also extremely very sparsely populated by the Spanish. We'll talk more in California as we go on. It was actually sorry, quick side note. You know how I get distracted, but basically right here, this dark purple, that's actually the Russians. They set up fishing trading posts along the Pacific coastline here, going into Alaska, British Columbia, and then all the way down to California. The Spanish felt threatened by that, so they started to try to, convince Spanish settlers to settle in California. And initially, they were far outnumbered. The Native Americans were like 250,000 Native Americans lived in California, but within like 70 years, I think the population of 250,000 natives in California will be reduced down mainly through hard labor, disease, death, really bad conditions there for those natives, down to like less than 4,000. It's genocide. So who strategically holds the advantage? We're talking about the British here in the 13 colonies mainly versus the French here mainly in like Canada, the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley. Well, a lot is going to depend on the Native Americans and which Native tribes side with who, because they know the land better, because nobody really controls this area that's disputed. That's why it's in gray, the Ohio River Valley. But the British do have a lot more people, which is going to be a lot easier. They don't have to send a lot of troops over. They have colonial troops as well as the British regulars who are coming. They also have, speaking of which, an easier time resupplying across the Atlantic Ocean, and less of a chance of being blockaded off than like the French will. There at that's the mouth of the St. Lawrence there. What is at stake? Lots and lots and lots of territory. The future of North America is at stake. The future of the United States, because the French and Indian War, the cat's scratching the couch. It's a lovely sound. The French and Indian War is the war that will make the American Revolution happen. Now, it doesn't happen immediately after the war ends. The Treaty of Paris that ends the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the overarching conflict, takes place in 1763. And the American Revolution will not officially get underway with like the first battles of Lexington and Concord until 1775. So, I mean, I'm not great at math, but that's like what, 12 years later or something. So it's not an immediate thing, but what happens is that the British spend massive amounts of money, funding this 7 Years' War, not just sending soldiers and supplies and everything to North America for the French and Indian War part of this, but all over the world. They send soldiers to India and to the Philippines and in Asia and everywhere. And so they spend so much money on this war, kind of bankrupts the British government. And to make that money back, what are the British going to do? Who are they going to tax? So we'll talk all about that in a little bit, but those are the things to keep in mind and why the French and Indian War is so important. Now, I said this war all gets kickstarted by a young George Washington, so let's talk about George. It's also ironic that it's during the French and Indian War that King George II dies, and George III will take over as the King of England, and he will be the reigning monarch, King George III, during the American Revolution. Actually, he reigns for a very long time, all the way into the 1800s, although he starts to go mad there a little bit at the end. Now, George Washington was born to a very wealthy Washington, Virginia planter family. His father was a justice of the peace. His first wife had died, so he remarried a wealthy widow himself. And And basically, George Washington is the eldest son of his father's second marriage. But from his father's first marriage, he has some older siblings, including his beloved older brother, Lawrence Washington, who kind of greatly helped to shape Washington's life. Because George Washington actually loses his father. His father dies from disease in, I don't remember what year, but Washington was only like 11 years old. Okay. I think that was like the 1740s, because he's going to be a very young man when this French Indian War takes place. So he's only 11 when his father dies. And so it's kind of his older brother who takes him under his wing and shows him the ropes, and who Washington really wanted to emulate, his older brother, Lawrence. Let's see. George Washington also, he was supposed to, like his older half siblings, go over and get more of a formal education in England. But because his father died, he was only able to go to formal schooling up through the age of 11. And he always kind of felt embarrassed by that for the rest of his life. He learned a little bit of mathematics, a little bit of arithmetic and writing, but he wasn't very polished. In fact, a lot of his very famous etiquette and mannerisms and his very genteel style, he's very charismatic, and people always applauded, how well he comported himself. A lot of that actually came from his true love, who was not Martha Custis, the woman that he marries that will become our first lady eventually, Martha Washington. No, in fact, the week of his wedding, Washington sent a steamy, heartfelt, kind of heartbreaking love letter to his true love, Sally. And Sally Fairfax was a woman that he could never be with, even though he loved her, because she was married to his best friend / kind of his mentor, Lawrence's father-in-law. So she was the one that kind of taught him how to dance and taught him all these things, and he really loved her. She's kind of a little bit older woman, but they could not be. It was not meant to be. And he marries Martha Custis, who was a wealthy widow. She had 2 young children who Washington will become a father to. But the main thing is that Martha Custis was super loaded. She was very, very rich. And Washington, he had a few slaves, and he had quite a bit of land when he married her. And then with her property that she brought to the marriage and her slaves, he became one of the wealthiest men in all of Virginia. And eventually he inherits Mount Vernon, which will become his famous home and plantation, from his older half-brother, who he loved so much, Lawrence. Lawrence also was in the military. That's what kind of inspired Washington to join the British military, because remember, Washington was born as a British citizen in Virginia. And Lawrence eventually gets tuberculosis, and they actually go to Barbados as Lawrence is dying, hoping the warm weather will kind of improve his physique, but it doesn't work, and they come back to Virginia, and Lawrence dies. Washington, meanwhile, on the trip had survived a bout of smallpox, which will be important later. We talk about like Valley Forge and the smallpox vaccinations. Washington was already immune because he'd had it before. But when Lawrence died, Washington inherits Mount Vernon. That will be his home and plantation for the rest of his life. So, all that being said, George Washington, 21 years old in 1753. He is a land surveyor. He's not yet married at this point. He's just 21. He was very gifted, though, at map making. That's what a surveyor does, is they make maps. And he is going to be tasked as a young, ambitious military major in the colonial British troops by the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, to go and scout out and try to remove any French forces from this territory of the Ohio River Valley. See, Virginia had laid claim to this region. Let me go back to the map. Virginia, right here, had laid claim to this region over here, and had formed a new company. Remember at the beginning of all this, we talked about the Virginia Company? a joint stock company. Well, here you have a new joint stock company called the Ohio Company, formed by a lot of these wealthy Virginians, including Lawrence Washington and his little brother George Washington, and the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Dinwiddie. And so the Ohio Company is going to send this young, eager beaver, ambitious man, George Washington, who's very good with maps and stuff, and who has had relationship with Native Americans. They're going to send him up to this Ohio country to kind of investigate and see what's going on, and to warn the French that, this is English territory. And that is where all of this is going to get started. So let's talk about what's going on. The French, for their part, let me make sure I'm not. Ooh, okay. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to make sure I don't go way too long on this. So I'm setting a timer for myself so I don't torture y'all for like too long, but I love talking about this stuff. Anyway, back in the late 1600s, Sieur de La Salle, French explorer, he traveled down the mighty Mississippi River and all the way to Louisiana, and actually even went on his last expedition where he was axe murdered and everything, into Texas. And if you kind of think that name La Salle sounds familiar, here in Waco, we have La Salle, the road. La Salle is right there near the Baylor Stadium, and it goes across the Brazos. Yeah, that's named after the French explorer, Sieur de La Salle. And that's where, and he was the one that actually named Louisiana, that territory, which eventually became the state of Louisiana, he named it after King Louis. So the French, that's where they got their claims from. Now, in the 1740s, in 1749, you have Pierre Saint-Laurent, a French military leader who was tasked by the French government to go into the Ohio country, to go into this disputed region here that France is claiming. So here's the Mississippi, here's Louisiana, this is all the Louisiana territory, this is Sieur de La Salle, kind of, I think he died in Navasota over here. So Pierre Saint-Laurent is tasked to go into the Ohio country and basically claim it for France. And the ingenious way that he's going to do this is with lead plates that he will subsequently bury in the ground. What could go wrong? Now, first off, some of you are like, what, lead plates? Isn't that like environmentally not a good idea? Yes, because that will eventually lead to the lead seeping into the groundwater because you're burying giant lead plates, and then you will have contaminated lead-filled water, which is, poisonous. Also, think about what they're trying to do here. They're trying to mark their territory. Having things buried underground isn't the best way to mark off, hey, this is mine. Usually you do that with like a big banner and a flag and like walls and other stuff to say, hey, border here, this is my land, don't go onto it. So the whole mission of Saint-Laurent wasn't extremely successful. The burying of the lead plates, it's not going to be great. And what ends up happening is that both the Ohio Company, led by these Virginians, in addition to many other British colonies, as well as France, is all laying claim to this same territory. And here you have in the Treaty of Logstown, right here, just before the war breaks out, the Iroquois have commissioned one of the local chieftains, Tenacreson, who, that's a really long name, so I'm just going to call him what often historians call this guy. He's called the Half King. Tenacreson is the Half King. He was kind of given some, or you could say half, authority to negotiate with the British about giving the British this land in the Ohio country. But at the same time, the French also thought they had an agreement with the Iroquois that they could have this land. So both sides think that it's theirs. Okay, that's the long and short of it. And at the Treaty of Logstown, that's where the British and the Half King agreed that this would be their land. But again, he only has half the authority. He would need to confirm with the Iroquois. It's all very muddled. And in comes this 21-year-old George Washington on a scouting mission in 1753. Now, he runs into the French. Fort Duquesne is right there at the mouth of the Ohio rivers, so the Allegheny and the Monongahela. Monongahela sounds weird. But at the fork of those two great rivers, there's a French fort built, Fort Duquesne. Now, this is around the site of modern day city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And George Washington gets there, and he has a very small force because Virginia, while wanting to claim this territory, was not willing to give a lot of funding in order for Washington to actually do this. So he has a very small force behind him, and the French are pretty well garrisoned, have a pretty sizable force. And Washington, all young and stuff, says, um, I need you all to please leave. I have been tasked to tell you that you must go. He's young and full of it and all this. And the French leader at the garrison there at Duquesne basically laughs at Washington and says, "Shut up, kid. Come, I'll give you some supper, and then I'm going to send you on your way." Kind of treats him like a puppy. He's a little kid, just kind of annoying. Doesn't take him super seriously. And over dinner, the French commander basically tells Washington, I don't care that you've British have laid claim to this. The French have this territory. Now go report back to your superiors in Virginia and let them know that this territory is already ours, the French. And so, Washington doesn't really have much of a choice. It's all very civil. Nobody really gets hurt or anything. And so he goes back to Virginia, kind of his tail between his legs, to report back to Dinwiddie and to the House of Burgesses, remember the British government there, that sorry, ain't gonna happen. I need a bigger force. Well, turns out in 1754, the Ohio Company puts a little bit more pressure. Dinwiddie becomes the governor, okay? And they're a bit more interested in this territory, willing to give the now 22-year-old George Washington a bit more manpower. And so he actually now is going to be in charge of a bit of a larger force, and actually given instructions that he is to lay claim to this Ohio country. And if the French try to stall him again and tell him to leave, he is to tell them to leave. And basically that means, if you're hearing that, that means he is authorized to use force. Now, they're not saying that. Nobody wants to start a war here. So this is, for all ostensive purposes, this is a diplomatic mission. But for the young, eager to prove himself, ambitious Major Washington, this is a bit of a military opportunity, which leads us to the Jumonville affair, or the Battle of Jumonville Glen. I am terrible at French names, so I'm not even gonna try to pronounce like his whole name, but Jumonville is the French commander, kind of like Washington. He's young, and he's been tasked by his superiors to go and find any British that are in the Ohio country and tell them to get out. Just like Washington was sent in there to find and search for any French and tell them to get out. So they're both kind of wandering around the Ohio country, and eventually they get word of one another from their Indian scouts. Washington gets the drop on this French commander and his small group. Washington, with a group of about 40, detaches from his larger group. He's accompanied by several dozen Native American allies. Washington has some Native American allies, as do the French. And one of those Native American allies that accompanies Washington is Tenackerson, the Half King. And they come across the French, and nobody knows exactly who fired the shot first, because this is a very important battle. This is kind of what starts the French and Indian War, which starts the 7 Years' War, the first, global war, which will lead to the American Revolution and the beginning of the United States of America. Okay, I'll try to calm down. But anyway, nobody knows who fired the first shot, but it's over in 15 minutes. In his journal, Washington writes about how sweet the whizzing of the bullets were as they passed by. Like, basically, this young 22-year-old George Washington, he's getting a serious adrenaline rush from battle, and he likes it. He likes being in the thick of violence. He's not scared at all. And this will be something that defines George Washington moving forward. Like, he's not a great military strategic planner when it comes to the offense. In fact, most times when he's on the offense, he botches it up terribly. But in the thick of fighting, he is incredibly inspiring to his men, because he's fearless. We'll see this again at the Battle of Monongahela, but basically Washington believes he's bulletproof. And I think he might be right, considering how many times the bullets literally get, this close to him, going through his clothing, and he never gets hit by bullets. He was immune to them, I guess. But yeah, he liked being in the thick of battle. The British very quickly defeat the small French force there, and this is when things get interesting and terrible. The French that are left, they surrender, right? They put up the white flag and they say, "We surrender." And as Washington is getting a translator, like, was he really the best pick to do this? Because he didn't even speak French. He's going on a diplomatic mission to the French, whatever. But as Washington and his translator are trying to talk to the French commander there, Jumonville, about like, oh, we found you in our territory, get out. Oh no, this is our territory. As they're about to have their little tete-a-tete. Tenackerson, the half king, Washington's Native American ally, walks up to the French commander Jumonville with a tomahawk. That's like a small Native American axe. And as Washington is like trying to talk with this guy, the half king takes his tomahawk and he splits Jumonville's head, his skull, right in front of Washington. Like Washington's just like, his mouth is open. He's just like, his face is covered in blood. He's just like, what just happened? Okay. Now it turns out, this is the half king's story, that basically he claims that his father was brutally murdered by the French, and that they had basically eaten his father's organs and bathed in his father's blood. And if that's true, then that's horrifying. We can understand why he wanted some revenge against the French. Washington clearly was startled and upset by this news. And he's now bathed in the French commander's blood. Now, this was, remember, a diplomatic mission, okay? So much for diplomacy. You ain't gonna have too much peace when you just split the enemy commander's head when he just surrendered in front of you. And of course, the half king is an ally functioning under the leadership of Washington. So Washington is responsible here. And so what Washington is going to do, and keep in mind, this is 22-year-old George Washington, who will go on to become America's first president. Before that was the leader of the Continental Congress, America's, founding father, the man who, chopped down a cherry tree and could not tell a lie, according to the fables and stuff. He's going to tell some lies here, because this is bad. This is real bad. So what Washington does is he collects the other French survivors, and he's going to send them back to Virginia as prisoners of war, and instruct Dinwiddie, the governor, that basically don't believe a word that these French prisoners say happened. If they try to talk about what happened to Jumonville, don't believe anything they say, because they're probably spies. Okay, so he lies there. And then in his official account, in his diary entries of this, he's talking about the bullets whizzing by and stuff. He just says, for Jumonville's death, that we also, in the shooting, killed their commander. So he doesn't mention anything about the half king butchering this guy, splitting his skull open with a tomahawk. And then I didn't even mention, but the half king, maybe in revenge for what he said had been done to his parents, he takes Jumonville's brain matter and basically washes his hands in it. I mean, that was disgusting. He did that right in front of Washington. Washington leaves all of that out of his report. But eventually, of course, there were French survivors that will tell this story, and it gets back to Jumonville's older brother, who will be very, very upset at George Washington. And when Washington carries on to try to get to Fort Duquesne, he will be encountered by a much larger French force who is very, very upset at him and ready and out for his blood. And this is where Washington quickly tries to erect a little makeshift fort right on the edge of a forest. This is called Fort Necessity. So on the map here, there we go. So you can actually see it right here. So this is Fort Duquesne. And you had the Battle of Jumonville Glen occurring here. This is all the Ohio country. This is Western Pennsylvania. This is the state of Ohio today. And right there where the dot is, that is Fort Necessity. crappy, tiny little fort that's built like it's within 100 feet of the woods. So it's perfect cover for anybody trying to fire on you. There's no actual like roofing because they build this so quickly that all of their munition gets rained on. So, you know, wet munition, this is the 1700s. It's not going to fire too well. It's all wet. And the night before the French are about to set upon them, Washington's Native American allies, including the Half King, they leave him. They actually abandon Washington, saying this guy's gonna lose. He's dead meat. Don't wanna be with him. So he's been abandoned by his native allies. He knows the French are out for his blood after what had happened at the Jumonville affair. And Washington's men basically they know they're about to die. They're like, what the heck? So they break into the liquor storage, and they, you know, they get boozed up. They get very drunk this night before the French are about to attack them. Washington literally, I mean, he's about to die. There's no way this little fort that was built out of necessity. What was the fort built out of? If you say wood, I'm going to find you. But this fort necessity is not going to hold up, and they are about to die. So the soldiers say, what the heck? They get drunk. Washington writes his final letters. And then the next day, everybody's surprised when the French commander, literally the older brother of Jumonville, the guy whose head was split, asked for a parley with George Washington. Remember, if you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, a parley, it's like a, you know, let's have a little peace conference. And so Washington goes out of the fort and meets with the French commander. And the translator is there again. And the French commander has Washington agree to sign this document that says that Washington basically surrenders. Now, remember, Washington cannot read or write French. The translator was not very good. And this older brother, the French commander, what he actually has included on the surrender document is that Washington takes all responsibility for firing the first shots and killing Jumonville. Basically, that Washington was the aggressor, that he was not there diplomatically, that he sought a fight, and that it was basically all his fault. Washington didn't know that he was signing this. He couldn't read French. The translator wasn't very good, didn't help him much. And so he signs this giving, you know, he's fully complicit in all this. And then he, with his, again, the second time with his tail between his legs, he travels back to Virginia and he thinks he is about to be, you know, seriously demoted. He should have been, right? Like he lied. He allowed to this major international incident to occur. That's going to get this major war started, that's going to kill all these people. He didn't succeed in any of his objectives and he just made things worse. So, I mean, he's ready to be harangued when he gets back to Virginia, but actually the House of Burgesses, they blame the other colonies and stuff for not helping out and giving him more supplies. And so Washington comes out of this pretty scot-free. All right. Whew. We're going to take a short break before we go back to the French and Indian War. Let's go ahead and wrap up this lecture there. And I'll just leave you with that question. How does the French and Indian War begin? Thank you guys very much for your attention. I will catch you next time.